Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's going to trouble the water. Activism is not for the faint of heart. You must be bold, you must be brave, and you must bare your heart for the world to see in order to cross the murky rivers of politics, of protests, of backlashes, to reach the shore of liberation, of liberty, of peace, of justice, and of joy. And today, because today is the 100th anniversary of the Suffrage Amendment, of the 19th Amendment, today we're going to highlight just a few of those women, those African American women who were influential in the suffrage movement here in Tennessee, as well as in the national conversation and movement of the suffrage movement. So, one thing I would like for you all to keep in mind is that the conversation of suffrage, specifically universal suffrage and black suffrage, did not begin in the 1900s. They began with the conversation of abolition of slavery. The same groups of people, the same ideology that led to the abolition of slavery was also influential in the suffrage movement as well. Here in Tennessee, with the onset of the Civil War, with the contraband camps located in Memphis and Nashville, the discussion of black suffrage or universal suffrage began. Now, these gatherings were illegal. You can't be contraband and then start talking about political rights and political consciousness. So keep that in mind. But they did it anyway, regardless of the risks. These groups of people who spanned the breadth of class, from enslaved or formerly enslaved to black elites, led protests, they led marches, they lobbied for black suffrage here in the state, and specifically universal suffrage. Now, when we talk about women's suffrage, there are a couple of things you have to keep in mind when you're talking about African American or black women suffragists. One thing you have to keep in mind is that they were operating in a reality where race, class, and gender worked hard against them. There were lots of stereotypes. There was the stereotype of the amoral or childish black person. There's also the stereotype of the prostitute, based on the heavy and violent exploitation of African American women's bodies during the slave trade. So emerging out of this context to push for suffrage is something we have to keep in mind. It was a risky adventure. Now, another thing that's different between African American suffragists and the white women suffragists is that there was an emphasis on community uplift. Lift as we climb, lifting as we climb. Suffrage was not just for women, for black women to get political power and leadership and glory. Suffrage meant that they could cast votes in favor of their communities, for decent housing where you're not charged more for rent than your white counterparts, or health care that actually helped you get well rather than sicker, or something that was not subpar education. These were concerns of African American suffragists leading up to the 1920 passage of the Suffrage Amendment. These women didn't just work within their communities, they also utilized their memberships and networking in church and secular organizations to influence the social reform agenda of the white women counterparts. So that include church meetings where they would go and speak about the need for suffrage and the need for community reform. That would include political rallies. That includes writing articles and letters and essays. That included going to the state capitol building, specifically the Tennessee State Capitol building, which was built by enslaved people, to talk to a group of white women and tell them how much your community needed and valued the right to vote and political participation. These are all the things that black women suffragists had to keep in mind, had to operate in at great risk for themselves. Another thing that I want you to keep in mind is that simply because of your class was not an excuse for your lack of involvement. Everyone had a duty to serve their community and their families and themselves in some form of fashion, which is why the black club movement arose and became so influential leading up to the 19th Amendment and even past that. These clubs advocated for the education of women specifically so that they could uplift their communities. But they also utilized their economic resources in the form of paying for a suffrage leader to participate in a march. That would be Ida B. Wells and the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago, Illinois. Or registering women and men in places where black communities had access to local elections. These were black women clubs. Now, there are four women who influenced the suffrage movement locally here in Tennessee as well as nationally. These four have several things in common. One is all four were called to teach in some form or fashion, and they taught in public schools, and they politically advocated for public school funding and resources. Another thing is pride. No matter what you read about these women, their own words or the words of their allies or enemies, you can tell that these women had a lot of pride, not only in themselves, but also the communities that they represented. All four women also called Memphis or Nashville home at some point of a time, even though two would go on to leave in order to better themselves and also to escape the level of oppression that was present here at the time. The first two women were locals of Nashville, Tennessee. They were heavily involved with building the alliances necessary for the suffrage amendment to be successful, as well as getting some reforms passed for African American communities. One woman was named Dr. Mattie E. Coleman. The other woman was Juno Frankie Pierce. Both women were either born at the tail end of slavery or right after, and were raised in communities by people who experienced slavery. Both women went on to get graduate degrees. Dr. Coleman graduated from Meharry in Nashville, Tennessee, and was an active physician. Juno Frankie Pierce graduated from a college also in Nashville, Tennessee, which was Roger College. Dr. Coleman, as well as Juno Frankie Pierce had the opportunity to speak at the state capitol building to urge the necessity not just for black women suffrage, but also the educational reforms needed for girls who were coming from high poverty areas and falling into delinquency. Now, there are two other women that I would like to highlight today, and they were influential on the national scale. But both of them called Tennessee home. The first is Ida B. Wells Barnett, and the second is Mary Church Tyrell. Now, Ida B. Wells was born into slavery in Holly Springs, Mississippi, but she was born at the tail end as well, and she was raised as a free child. She had misfortune hit her life early. Her parents, both of her parents, as well as one sibling, fell ill and died from one of the yellow fever epidemics. So she dropped out of college, Rusk College at the time, to care for her remaining siblings as a teacher. She convinced the principal that she was 18 when she was 16. She moved her family to Memphis, Tennessee because of the opportunities available, finished her education at Fisk University, and then subsequently started off her anti-lynching campaign, her anti-discrimination, anti-Jim Crow campaign, based off the life experiences that she was having and the experiences of her friends and loved ones. Her friend, who was an owner, one of the owners of People's Grocery, a mutual friend of theirs, Mary Church Tyrell's and Ida B. Wells, was lynched because his business, he and two other people, was lynched because his business brought in too much revenue and was competing with the white grocery store. The essays that she wrote, the articles that she wrote at her newspaper, because she was the owner of two newspapers in Memphis, Tennessee, were so inflammatory that a mob came and destroyed her office and threatened her life if she should ever set foot back into Memphis, Tennessee. She just happened to be away at the time of the mob violence. She moved to Chicago, Illinois, where she continued her activism, her international anti-lynching campaign, as well as the suffrage and anti-Jim Crow campaigns. She started the first known suffrage group for African American women called the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago, Illinois. She participated in the 1913 March protest at Washington, D.C., but she refused to march in the back, as was asked by the white women leading. She marched in the front because she felt that her people needed to be represented where the cameras were. That's where she needed to be, not in the back. Now, Mary Church Tyrell was a native Memphian. Her parents became some of the wealthiest black people in the American South at the time. Her father was a millionaire, and her grandfather was also wealthy because he was a riverboat captain, and he actually owned her father before the emancipation of enslaved people. So she also has an interesting intersection of class and wealth and race and gender. She was what you call a race woman. She, along with Ida B. Wells, helped co-found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, as well as the National Association of Colored Women. And in both organizations, suffrage was a key concern. Mary Church Tyrell also spoke at several conventions for suffrage, pushing not just the reason why black women needed that vote, but also what they would do with the additional political power that they could wield, like getting free kindergartens for working class women. Mary Church Tyrell did not stay in Memphis, Tennessee. She moved to Washington, D.C., where she was a teacher and also led the anti-Jim Crow movement in businesses such as restaurants. Mattie Coleman, Dr. Mattie Coleman, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Mary Church Tyrell, Juno Frankie Pierce. If you don't remember anything else today, please remember that brave, bold, and bare-hearted black women such as these and others whose names we have lost to history used all of the resources at their disposal to push for suffrage within their communities, as well as for universal suffrage for everyone. My name is Jessica Gossett. I'm a park ranger at T.O. Fuller State Park. Thank you and happy anniversary 19th Amendment.